Hello, everyone. Welcome into a sort of recap of sorts from SEC Media Days. Mike and I have both safely made it home. We are sitting out some pretty dreadful storms here in Athens at the moment, but we'll keep you guys entertained here. Talking the latest out of SEC Media Days. Those wrapped up today. South Carolina, Ole Miss, Tennessee, all speaking, taking the podium today. Mike, you were in Nashville this morning. You were there for when Josh Heupel spoke. Lane Kiffin, Shane Beamer of South Carolina. What did you learn this final day here at SEC Media Days?
Well, I thought Lane Kiffin really kind of gave the start of the day when he talked about the different NIL issues that college football is going through. And he basically said, it comes down to which college can spend the most money on players. And he said, if you want an idea, someone said, well, can you give us an idea who that is? He said, just look at the recruiting rankings. I thought that was pretty pointed. And maybe there's truth to that, but another pretty clairvoyant point was with states changing their law.
And we lost Mike. So those Athens thunderstorms, they are knocking some power out. I briefly lost power here a minute ago, sort of taking the baton there from Mike. As we recap things here at SEC Media Days, week is in the books. You will find tomorrow you get the all SEC teams. You get the predicted order of finish. I have a good feeling Georgia will not just be the team predicted to win the SEC East, but win the entire SEC as a whole. And that is something that I think Mike and I will get into in a second here if he's able to successfully rejoin. Here we go. And he is back better than ever. Mike, lost you there for a second, but you were back on. Those storms are pretty powerful. Like, I don't know, Jalen Carter coming up the middle trying to knock you out there. But continue on what you learned at SEC Media Days today.
Yeah, I was talking about Lane Kiffin in his sermon this morning about NIL and how that has affected the league. And when someone asked him, well, which programs had the greatest advantage, he said, look at the recruiting rankings to see which boosters. He said he didn't want to go into rankings. He said, but, Commissioner Sankey spoke to me this morning and, we've come a long way together. I don't need to answer. He didn't want to get himself in trouble, but I thought it was pretty pointed. And it's probably true that the school rankings are the ones that are spending the most amount of money. And he said, you can't blame them. This is the system. And Lane also said, Connor, he doesn't think it's always going to be this way. He thinks we're in an era right now where kids can negotiate twice a year, 3 times over the course of their career. Once when they're going to school, once when they transfer, and again when they're grad transfers, and they have 2 opportunities to do it per year. He said that, and I think he's right about that. I think we're seeing right now, as crazy as it's ever going to get now, how and when they standardize that, I don't know. But if you're a Georgia fan, I wouldn't want to be in any hurry, because the Dogs are doing just fine with the way the system is right now. I think Alabama's doing just fine with the way the system is. Obviously, Texas A&M last year had a record recruiting class, albeit we learned that recruiting players is different than retaining players. So something to watch for there moving forward. Kirby Smart telling us when he was at Media Days just a couple days ago, looks like Connor lost power there. Connor in the dark. Connor's going unplugged tonight, folks. But Kirby Smart was telling us they look at 2 things. They look at the recruitability of a player and I guess the signability of a player. And then they look at the retainability of a player, right? And I thought that was really important, because Kirby said, hey, we got to get the right guys at Georgia that they know will stick around. Not like Bear Alexander, all right? Let's just say it. I mean, that was a guy that did what Lane Kiffin said, probably. Came in, had a good first year, and then went somewhere else. And Kirby said precisely, he didn't use Bear's name, but he said, that's exactly what you don't want. You don't want a guy that you bring in, whatever you do to get him in, and then Connor, after 1 year, he's gone. And I think just as bad was Smoke Bowie leaving. And we talked about that earlier. I mean, here's a guy, like you said, that, this is a guy that's going to count against their scholarship numbers. And this is a double whammy. You took a chance on this guy. So the net result, and it remains to be seen how this will play out, but Georgia got Dominic Lovett and Ra Thomas out of the portal for Adonai Mitchell and Bear Alexander. Connor, I don't think that was a good trade.
No, and it speaks to the point. One of the things that Kirby brought up, and it's been something I've been thinking on for a while, and I think it's a big reason why Georgia's won back-to-back national championships. That 2021 recruiting class, when COVID was at its height, and from a guy that follows recruiting pretty closely, we're just never going to know less about prospects than we did in that cycle, because those guys, not only were they not allowed to visit schools, see them and whatnot, but a lot of those guys, Kamari Lassiter talked about this, he didn't get a chance to work out for the Georgia staff. And so for him to earn his offer, he had to send in roughly 800 videos to prove to the Georgia staff that he was worthy of earning that offer. He certainly has been so. And Kirby Smart brought this up right now through 2 years, and obviously there will be further attrition from this as this class gets deeper. But of the 20 guys that Georgia signed in that 2021 recruiting cycle, 17 of them are still with this team. Georgia has very successfully been able to combat sort of that portal mindset when it certainly came to that 2021 class, which those guys are now juniors. Your Brock Bowers, your Jamon Dumas-Johnsons, Kamari Lassiter, who we heard from this week, Amarius Mims, who's going to be your starting right tackle this year. Those juniors who are usually probably the best players on your team. Obviously, you need the seniors for leadership, but sometimes those guys go pro after the junior year, like you saw so many guys from that 2020 class. And so that Georgia has so successfully, even in somewhat of a pre-NIL age, been able to find guys that fit their culture and want to stick around. Sure, they're going to be outliers, I think, in every class. I think Bear Alexander is one worth mentioning there. A.D. Mitchell is certainly another one from this class. How well these top programs combat the transfer portal, I think, is something that is just going to be a big thing to watch going forward. And if you're a program like a Georgia, if you're a program like an Alabama, you're always sort of going to be operating at deficit when it comes to the transfer portal, just because, again, you recruit so well on the front end. Naturally, if guys aren't playing, and that's just a reality of being at a program like Georgia, those guys are ultimately going to look elsewhere and look to play elsewhere. And so I think you saw today the report that a couple senators in Congress are going to propose an NIL bill. We'll see if that ends up getting passed. I'd be, quite frankly, pretty surprised about that, given the way Congress has been, not just recently, but for seemingly most of the 21st century. And I would even caution maybe against some of that, just given that if that NIL bill that is set to be proposed does pass, it sounds like it's going to give the NCAA some real teeth in terms of enforcement and what they'll be able to do there. I would just say be careful what you wish for in those regards, because the NCAA has not proven to be, I think, a wise or adept governing body, especially when it comes to handing out punishments. And ironically, I believe Lane Kiffin's first question today was about those punishments that Tennessee received. Josh Heupel spent a considerable amount of time talking about that today. Mike, you know this Tennessee program well. It was a team last year talking with a lot of bravado, a lot of gusto, and then they come in Athens and look, I know the final score was 27-13. That game was not that close. And that was a Georgia program that showed there was still a long way for this Tennessee program to go. But I heard Joe Milton today say, hey, the goal for us this year is to win the SEC. So you hear Josh Heupel saying, we're the real UT. There's only one of us. And we left some things on the table last year that we didn't fully accomplish. And so, you heard yesterday Alabama saying, hey, our goal is to win it all this year. You heard Tennessee talking with a similar gusto. Mike, what do you make of Tennessee and sort of the way they're carrying themselves entering this season?
Well, a lot there. First of all, I want to back up to one thing, because I couldn't figure out who the three guys were that were gone. I only counted two. Is there somebody that I'm missing? So I don't know if you have that off the top of your head or if you can look that up. But who are the three guys out of the 20 that are no longer?
I will pull that up quickly here.
All right. We'll let Connor look that up. And I'm going to go back to yesterday. My favorite moment was the Trench King. Like, first of all, the guy is not the best offensive lineman in the league. If you're going to call yourself the Trench King, you should probably be the best offensive lineman on your own team. But the pundit said TK, it was an Alabama offensive lineman. He said they're going to win it all. I mean, he just, and it was funny because I talked to the Alabama sports information assistant. I'm like, what'd you think of the Trench King? And I told him, he goes, no, don't tell me that. We said don't say anything to get in trouble. I said, I don't think he's in trouble. He's an offensive lineman. Connor, if anybody is allowed to talk smack at the SEC media days, I am fully behind an offensive lineman doing it, because we're never going to say his name again. Nobody's going to do a special. He's not going to be in the ESPN top 10. I say let the lineman eat. When it comes to talking trash at the SEC media, I'm completely behind him. And but it was funny because Alabama, it gave you some insight as to what Alabama's think. Listen, that is a hungry program, and those are extremely talented players. And if they find a quarterback that can do anything, remember this guy named Stetson Bennett that no other Power 5 school wanted to offer, that was going to go play for Billy Napier at Louisiana, that was a 4-stringer that Todd Monken all but ran off, making him a 4th-stringer in the spring game. That guy was a 2-time championship game MVP. So, and playoff MVP in the semifinals. So my only thing is this, not to undersell Stetson, because I'd never do that. But if Georgia can do it with Stetson twice, then who's to say that Alabama doesn't have somebody that's just good enough not to get their team beat, that can develop, that can make plays. I'm not ready to count out the Tide because of their quarterback situation, but I will also point out that when Nick Saban had the best quarterback in the nation the last 2 years running, #1 overall draft pick, they didn't win a championship with Bryce Young. So, and he's got new coordinators. That's the other thing. So I enjoyed the Alabama guys yesterday. I enjoyed Coach Saban. I always enjoyed Coach Saban. I thought he was fun. I thought he was funny. He did skip his interviews on Radio Row, as I predicted. That's disappointing and not good. Kirby, conversely, did everything, was wonderful. It was the A1 version of Kirby Smart. And Connor sitting there with a look on his face like he knows who those 3 players are. Connor, who are those 3 players out of that 20 that are no longer with the team?
I do. So the 3 that are no longer with the team are A.D. Mitchell. Obviously, he is at Texas. Lavassier Carroll, who was moved to defensive back when he first got here and then transferred to South Carolina. He's no longer playing football due to injuries. And then the third one is their defensive lineman, Marlon Dean, who's also no longer playing football. So of those guys that are still playing football, A.D. Mitchell is the only one that is transferred out. And obviously he would be, I think, welcome into this program and be a big contributor for this team potentially going into this season. But Mike, you bring up a really interesting point there when talking about Alabama, and I think the Stetson Bennett one is an effective one. Last 2 years, Alabama's best player was Bryce Young. Will Anderson's incredible. Bryce Young was a better player than him. There's no real argument there. And this was certainly the case in 2022 and was to an extent in 2021. I think Alabama played through Bryce Young and wanted him to be the focal point of their team and the best player of their team. And they won 23 games over the last 2 seasons, 24 games potentially, if I'm doing the math there correctly. But it felt like something was off with Alabama those last 2 years. They were relying on Bryce Young so much, and he was able to bail them out most of the time. But you look at the Tennessee game and you look at the LSU game, those games were lost when he wasn't on the field. And so I think with what Saban is trying to do this year, and I'll be interested to see if he did it and does it with the coordinator hires that he brought in, Tommy Rees on the offensive side, Kevin Steele on the defensive side. I think he wants to become a more balanced football team. And so while I think we're right to be concerned about the Alabama quarterback position, I wonder if Saban is maybe trying to reset his team a little bit here and make it less reliant on the quarterback position as a whole. And if you tell me that they're able to do that and they're a more well-rounded team, again, I think one of the sneaky things, you bring up J.C. Latham and him calling himself the Trench King. Alabama's recruited very well on the offensive line in recent years. They have not played up to that standard on that offensive line there. They just have not been as good. I think Georgia has very clearly surpassed them in terms of offensive line supremacy in this conference. That's something they absolutely need to get back to as well there. There's talent there on the defensive side of the ball, and even though they have to replace some big-name guys, I think this Alabama defense, if they can, figure out how to play closer to Georgia's level than what they had sort of seen the last 2 years, that team's still going to be a problem. I'm sure we'll touch on who we think can ultimately win the SEC later on in tonight's show. But for me, again, Alabama, so much of the question is around the quarterback. And you were right. Look, Stetson Bennett was a big reason why Georgia won a national title last year. As good as he was in 2021 at times, he was not the reason they won a national championship that year. He did enough to where he was not making mistakes. He made a few plays when Georgia ultimately needed him to. But that team won because of its defense, because of its offensive line, because of timely playmaking, and obviously as well, great special teams. I think that's a recipe that Alabama believes it can follow going into this season. And if they're winning a national title this year, it's not with Bryce Young scoring 40 points against Georgia in the SEC championship game. It's not, Jalen Milroe leading a last-second drive against Auburn. That's not the recipe for success this year. It in some ways, I think, is going to be a throwback Alabama team. And I do think they have the talent to do it. I think the question is just, can they all come together? That 2021 Georgia team, Todd Monken was there in 2020. Dan Lanning was there in 2020. There was a lot of institutional knowledge there at that point. And so I think with Alabama, with so much turnover, and again, we talk about that junior class, those guys haven't won a national championship yet. And I know that's an unfair, standard to put on most guys, but the three guys we heard from Alabama at SEC Media Days, J.C. Latham, Dallas Turner, Kool-Aid McKinstry, are guys who are probably going to be first-round picks. Those guys haven't won a national title at Alabama, and there is something to be said about being able to go out there and actually do it. And look, they've got a tricky schedule. They have to play the SEC West, obviously. They have a home game against a very talented Texas team. I'll be interested in seeing if Alabama, and they are my pick to win the SEC West, I'll be interested in seeing if they're the team that Georgia sees in Atlanta at the end of the season. Given, look, Tennessee, I still think they're probably a year away. You heard Brian Kelly mention this from a recruiting standpoint. I think Tennessee, because of some of the exodus that they saw from that program at the end of the Jeremy Pruitt era, and because some of these self-imposed sanctions that they've had these last few years, they're probably a recruiting class or two away from maybe being closer where they need to be to compete. But I think Tennessee, I'll be interested in seeing this year. Hendon Hooker was a really good quarterback last year, and while Joe Milton has a ton of physical ability, he's also been benched twice, once at Michigan and once at Tennessee. Has he grown enough and taken the strides forward, not just to be a quarterback that can play every down, but can be a difference maker? Because that's what Tennessee is going to need, because they're still, in my opinion, not nowhere near good enough on defense to have that kind of an impact.
Yeah, and I'll say this too about that Tennessee team. And when I looked out there and watched him play in Georgia this year, a lot of those guys out there I recognized from when I covered the program. Now, take in mind, this is my 5th year covering Georgia. Or maybe, wait a minute. This is my 6th year covering Georgia. They had a lot of 6th-year seniors. They had a lot of older guys that were there all the way back to the Butch Jones era. And I believe 17 or 18 of those guys were Jeremy Pruitt signees as well, his first year. So those were a lot of guys that Jeremy had recruited, that had been with the program, that had seen things through, that didn't transfer. A lot of those blue-collar locker room guys. I mean, I thought that created a very special culture. Now, Tennessee has a lot of talent coming back, like Connor said, and they also have some very good recruits coming in. But what is the chemistry going to be like when you have all these NIL guys in there? And the reason I bring this up is because when we spoke with Texas A&M on day one, Aeneas Smith, the receiver, was like, yeah, we had a lot of guys that, had NIL money and, they didn't always listen or they weren't always coached. Texas A&M had issues because of that super recruiting class, because of the NIL guys that came in making more money than the guys that were already on the roster. Lane Kiffin talked about that. He said he's got players that come to him and say, wait a minute, coach, I'm starting ahead of this guy. Why is he getting paid more? Or I've been here longer. And Lane Kiffin says, look, it's not fair. You got to have a pro mentality, right? This is the way it is in the NFL too. And it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing for a team to accept that culture, or to have the culture to be able to accept that, to have the kind of leadership that you need to make sure that's not a factor. And I'm not sure where Tennessee is at with that locker room culture. I'm not saying it's bad because I don't know that. But like Connor said, there's no longer a guy like a Hendon Hooker in that locker room for everyone to rally around. And they do have the quarterback Nico from California that, I don't know, we saw reports that signed, for millions of dollars. Who knows what's true and what's not, but there is a dynamic to that. That guy's making more money than Joe Milton. What does that do to the chemistry, right? So you can look and see who has the most talent. Obviously, last year A&M did. 1 year later, A&M had 31 guys transfer out of the program, okay? Georgia has lost some leadership. Georgia has some NIL guys. How does the Georgia culture go? Kirby Smart says it's great. He says it's working out wonderful. Okay, we're going to find that out soon. Kirby said that he's going to see what they've got when they come back from the summer drills. And I think they've seen enough, Connor. They get to see these guys every now and then. I think Kirby's got a pretty good idea of what he has. I think he feels good about it. The quarterback situation, I think Kirby's sending us smoke signals here when he talks about other guys that are going to play. I think he needs to see more from Carson. He said that he needs to see more from Carson. We've learned, take Kirby Smart at his word. He's not a guy that's going to bluff. If Carson was the guy, he'd say Carson had a great summer and Carson's the guy, and he'd be getting 80% of the snaps like Stetson did last year, going, or probably 90% last year. If he was the dude, Kirby needs to see what happens under adversity, needs to see what happens on third downs, needs to see decision-making. He is telling you he has not seen enough of that yet. from Carson Beck. Now, it's a long runway, Connor. Not only do they have the fall and the scrimmages, they've got a schedule. Like I said, they got 3 Jamboree games in September. I don't know what we call South Carolina, maybe glorified scrimmage. I don't expect them to be much of a challenge whatsoever because of their line play before you go on the road and play Auburn. And Auburn, and Hugh Freeze, by the way, one of the highlights was Hugh said this is one of the most welcoming places that he'd ever been. Considering where he's been, that's saying a lot. I will say that.
So I think you touched on it with Carson there, and look, for a variety of reasons, I think some of the Carson Beck stuff, the Georgia quarterback stuff, got swept under the rug a little bit, or maybe missed a little bit for a variety of reasons in terms of what was said about it. Kirby wasn't really asked about it in the main room. It was sort of in those side rooms, those side interviews, where you sort of heard him talk about that there. And look, Brock Vandagriff is going to get game reps during the season, in part because Georgia's going to be up by so much. And I wouldn't be surprised if, like you saw, say, against UAB in 2016, where knowing what we know now, Stetson Bennett was just flat out better than Carson Beck in practice that week. And on, I believe, the third drive of that game, they still brought in Carson to sort of see what he can do. And obviously it didn't go well for Carson there, and he's owned that and admitted to it. I wouldn't be surprised if we see something similar there with Brock, at least to start the season, unless Carson Beck just comes out and flat out wows and makes it very obvious that he's the guy. But I'd be surprised if that happened. That's not a knock on Carson. That's just sort of the way we know Kirby Smart and Georgia are going to operate. And so I think Mike's right there with games against UT Martin, Ball State, and UAB, and you can mix in South Carolina there as well. Georgia's going to have time to sort of find the answers that they're looking for at that quarterback position. And again, having said all that, having laid all that out there about Carson Beck, he's still got Brock Bowers. Dominic Lovett is going to be a stud. Ladd McConkey, a guy who I don't think is going to make all SEC preseason team, but there are not 4 better receivers than him, in my opinion, in this conference. You'll find those out tomorrow. He's got the best, in my opinion, offensive line in the country playing in front of him. Cedric Van Pran, the best center in the country, calling things out. Carson Beck's not going to be asked to carry this team, and I think that's an important distinction there. He's going to be able to grow into the job, and it could be Brock Vandagriff there as well, but he's going to have enough talent around him to make things easy and to where, by the time they do play Ole Miss in November, they do play Tennessee at November 18th in Knoxville to end things there in SEC play. He's going to be grown enough by that point and have seen enough, whoever Georgia's quarterback is, to be at least a little bit more comfortable. And while that Tennessee game will obviously be a unique atmosphere, at that point in the year, he won't be a first-team starting quarterback anymore. He'll have made potentially 10 starts by that point. And so that's, in my opinion, the thing you're ultimately gearing up for. Those last 4 SEC games, Florida and Jacksonville, home against Missouri, home against Ole Miss, and then at Tennessee. Missouri, we'll see. Although they gave Georgia a lot of trouble last year, and they bring back most of their defensive line. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how things go from there. Mike, I believe on Monday or Tuesday's show, we broke down who we have in each division. I believe you picked LSU from the West. We both picked Georgia from the East. I took Alabama. I think we both have Georgia. Sort of a different type of question here. We both have Georgia. We both think Georgia can, and we both think Georgia will win the SEC. How many teams do you believe could legitimately win the SEC this season? I'm not saying you have to actually pick them, but you see schedule breaking the right way, the cohesion working, the talent necessary to do it. How many teams do you think could actually win the SEC?
I'm going to say 4. I'm going to say 4. I'm counting Texas A&M because that is such a is bombastic. That team is such a make or break. I mean, they could also go 5-7, okay, but they could go 11-1 and get hot. I mean, Bobby Petrino, I know there's a lot of jokes and a lot of talk about what he's done off the field, but that guy is an offensive genius. He is one of the best, and Jim Chaney's there too, by the way. And before you look down your nose at Jim Chaney, just remember what Georgia Tech was doing against Georgia early last year, and Jim did a good job at Tennessee. If anybody understands how to take apart the Georgia defense and Kirby Smart, it's Jim Chaney. I mean, he is a very smart coach, number one, but number two, he knows Georgia better than anybody out there, arguably, that Georgia's going to play against. I think that if Jimbo and Petrino can click, so that's why I said I think it's a small chance, but I think it's a chance. LSU and Alabama, clearly to me, 2 lead dogs. I would say there's a probably 95% chance, a 19 out of 20 chance that it's going to be one of those 2 teams that wins the West, right? And then I give A&M that dark horse chance. And then from the East, I just don't think there's anybody in the East that can win it but Georgia. I really don't. I know that Tennessee's excited. We talk about, what's the vibe. They're always excited in Knoxville. Even when they're not good, they're excited. And I lived there. I covered them for 14 years. Every year by the end of the summer, the Tennessee fans have themselves talked into winning the SEC championship in some way, shape, or form. They really do. Now, they're closer with Heupel than they've been in a while. But remember, I mean, Jeremy Pruitt won 8 games in a row there at one point. The Tennessee fans that throw him out and say they're the same ones that thought that Tennessee was on track and was going to beat Georgia when they brought that 8-game winning streak in against it. And by the way, if I'm not mistaken, didn't they actually lead Georgia at halftime of that game? I think they stuffed Zamir White at the 1-yard line and led Georgia at halftime. And then from the second half on, things got really bad for Jeremy Pruitt in Tennessee. It all came apart. Kirby and the Dogs blew him out in the second half. Jeremy lost the locker room in the post game. He went off on too many players. They didn't show up to play against Kentucky, and it was just all downhill, which is good. You don't ever want to lose to Kentucky. I mean, that just tells when you lose to Kentucky, bad things happen. Like, I'm sorry, they can say they're a football school and we can all, oh yeah, he's a good coach, whatever. By the way, the longest tenured coach in the nation not to at least win his division is Mark Stoops. So that is a definition of a basketball school, folks. When you can be somewhere 12 years and not even win your division, I don't know. Is it 12 years now, Connor? Something to that effect. I want to say he's tenured. I'm trying to remember.
At least 10 years.
Is it 10? Is it at least 10?
I think it's 10 years. Yeah, because Jeremy Pruitt was his replacement at Florida State, and they won the national title that year. So this will be, I believe, Mark Stoops' 10th or 11th season there.
There you go. Claims their football school. I guess we'll find out this year. Some people think they're going to be pretty good. I didn't pay much attention to them, to be honest with you. Maybe I'll regret that. I'll be searching for SEC media notes when they play Kentucky, but probably not. I'll be looking at the schedule to see if maybe we can catch a basketball game, that week or something. But I just can't get sold. And Shane Beamer, I like Shane Beamer as much as anybody on the planet. I had a random run. Me and a couple beat writers ran into the guy out in Atlanta back at the 2002 Peach Bowl, and he was, just as cool as anybody else at the bar, and it was cheers. He was a cool guy. He's still a cool guy. His videos are awesome. Him and Sam Pittman fight it out for the most likable coach in the league. I think those are two guys you'd say, oh, sure, I'll leave my kids here, babysit them. I'll be home whenever. You just love these guys. But Connor, as much as I want to believe in Shane Beamer in South Carolina, I just can't do it. I just am not bought in to sustained success there. They've had two of the best coaches in history in Lou Holtz and Steve Spurrier. And Spurrier came close. He at least got him to the SEC championship game. I think one year he beat Clemson, Florida, and Tennessee or something stupid like that. He had him as close as they've ever been. And he couldn't sustain it. He couldn't do it. And as much as I like Shane personally and what he stands for, and I'm big on Spencer Rattler's upside, there's just too many things that can go wrong there. So they're out. Tennessee lost a lot of the senior, older guys, the fabric of the team. So they're out. Vanderbilt, did you see their stadium's not even done? Did you see the picture? They're not even – I think they might have had media days there this year just to make sure Vanderbilt showed up. They're just not real. I'm sorry. They beat Florida, but hell, everybody's beaten Florida. Speaking of which, we're, 29 minutes, and we're just now mentioning Florida?
Billy Napier likes it that way.
Nobody. If Florida falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sense. They're just not significant anymore. And people, Billy Napier. It doesn't matter what happens this year. He'll get another. Are you crazy? If they have another losing season, he's gone. There's already a list being made out somewhere on the next Florida coach. This guy is not going to get the runway to survive another losing. Connor, he doesn't have any charisma. None. The guy is just so mundane. How did you get it done? You just hold up a car. I coached for Nick Saban. Okay, that gets you in the door, but it doesn't keep you in the room, man. So I don't believe in Florida. Missouri, look, it's a psycho program. We never know what we're going to get. We know, are they going to show up? Are they going to – hell, they might beat you one day. They might lose by 50 the next. They just don't have the culture there. And I think they lack the star power. And the fact that Lovett is here instead of there tells me everything you need to know. He doesn't believe in him. So why should we? Right. So it's Georgia. It's Georgia. And I can't even, I'm trying to think of a way Georgia could.
And hold on, give me 2 seconds.
I'm back. I was still trying to think of a way for Georgia to lose a game during the regular season. And I know the odds say they will because they've won 27 straight regular season games and nobody has three-peated since 1936. And now Lane Kiffin was talking about USC. So I'm going to throw this back to you here in a second. And right now, would you put this Georgia program, Connor, with what they've had star power, are you ready to compare that to the Pete Carroll USC teams in terms of their talent?
I think they're probably maybe a year or two away from getting to that entire USC run because, well, yes, they split a title in 2003, won in 04, came very close in 05. And that team 06, 07, 08 was still in a position where it was competing for national championships. And because it was, if there is a college football playoff in the 2000s, USC, I think, comes away with more national titles than the 1.5 that they ultimately did. And so because of that, and look, as well as the rise of the SEC, but I think USC in 06 and 07 would have given those Florida and LSU teams, they certainly run for their money. 08 Florida is a little bit of a different beast, which is why they're getting a Netflix.
Lane Kiffin's comment today, by the way, was they would have won 3 championships in a row if they could have tackled Vince Young, which I think is I think that's a fair statement.
That is a very fair statement. They also would have won a 3rd straight title if they had been able to get a 4th and 1 with Lendale White. They came very close to finding a way to win that game, and to that point, and sort of tying it back into Georgia, it's why it's very difficult to win 3 in a row. You have to have, from a one season standpoint, from a game by game standpoint, I don't see a team on Georgia's schedule right now beating them in a game this season. But when you start taking those 10,000 foot views, it just becomes a lot harder and a lot more can go wrong. I think Cedric Van Pran had a great quote about this, and I wrote this in one of the stories I did this week about, Georgia has to do everything right. And his quote was, "We do everything right, and by the grace of God, we're in a position to capitalize on that." You can do everything right, and sometimes the ball just doesn't bounce your way. I think you saw that with Georgia in 2017. You saw it, heck, even with them in 2018. They had the talent to be there, but to me, the biggest difference between 2021 and say 2018, aside from just a more talented defense, Georgia got the bounces in 2021. They didn't get them in 2018. And that's football. And that's why they play the games. And so while I think there are only 3 teams actually capable of winning an SEC championship this year, I think it's Georgia. I think it's Alabama. And I actually agree with you. I think it's Texas A&M. I think they have the talent. It can all come together for them. It can also all blow up spectacularly as we saw it do last season. I think I take Brian Kelly at his word. I think this is an LSU team that they could certainly get to Atlanta. They have the talent yet, and more so the depth to go through a full SEC win an SEC championship, And even you look at that 2018 Georgia team, a big reason why, you lose Monty Rice, you lose DeAndre Walker. They didn't have the guys ready behind them at that point to really make a difference. They certainly do now. And I think that's one of the big reasons why Georgia, even in a year where new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, you got to replace multiple first-round picks on that defensive front, an All-American safety in Chris Smith, Keely Ringo, a heck of a player at cornerback. Even with all of that, Georgia's still the favorite to win a national championship because their depth is so good and because they develop better than anybody. So I think as we put a bow on things here, and Mike, I'll toss it back to you. Your final thoughts, takeaways. One biggest thing from SEC Media Days, what did you learn this week, or what was the thing that, coming out of this big talking season debut, came away and sort of, that's my big thought from this week?
Just Georgia. Just Georgia comes across to me as the most put together, established, respected program in the league, period. I've been talking about it. People, oh, you cover them. That's why. No, that's not why. It's because you can feel Kirby Smart's energy in the room. You can see what the players go through when you go there for interviews. You understand about the culture and just how tightly things are run, the effort, the grind. You take that all in, and when you're around it, you feel it. And I've been fortunate over my career, 30 years now. I've covered three undefeated SEC teams, 93 Auburn, 98 Tennessee, and last year's Georgia team. And the thing I would say about Georgia was this program is run tighter and is more on the rails than those other two programs. Those other two programs were very good. 93 Auburn was a very charmed program. They were on probation. They weren't on TV, very close-knit. They had a lot to prove, right? They'd been 5-5-1 and 5-6 the previous years. 98 Tennessee was another group of guys that had something to rally around. All they'd heard about their first 3 or 4 years in the program was how it was all about Peyton Manning. Well, when Peyton Manning left, they all wanted to show that this was a team of no stars and they could win without a star like Peyton Manning, which is kind of goes back to our point we were making about Bryce Young. Maybe Alabama groups together and is actually better without that number 1 overall pick, as 98 Tennessee proved to be. The last two Georgia teams have been built around championship level defense. The thing that I don't think worry is the right word, but the thing I would note is that I don't think Mike Bobo has the same deck of cards as Todd Monken. Okay. Forget the Stetson Bennett factor for one moment. You could, some can or will make the argument that maybe Beck has more talent or maybe Vandergriff has more talent. Nobody has the savvy, though, and nobody has the experience. To Connor's point, may not have been Stetson Bennett leading the way in 2021, although he was the MVP and came through in the fourth quarter. 2022, a lot of it was Stetson Bennett. He made a lot of big plays in big moments. Granted, there was still some other key players, two jokers in the deck that are no longer there. You had the receiver out of the backfield, Kenny McIntosh. Kirby has said there's not another guy that's going to do what Kenny did 25, 30 yards downfield. You had Darnell Washington at 6'8", 280. Kirby says in today's story, you're not just going to plug in another tight end. It's going to be a more conventional offensive attack. Connor pointed this out earlier in the show. Jalen Carter, you went from having 12 guys on defense essentially to 11 guys on defense because there was only one Jalen Carter and nobody could block 88 in the college football ranks. We'll see if anybody can handle him one-on-one in the NFL. He was that dynamic of a football player. So what are you going to do without those three? I heard somebody make a good argument. I think it was Andy Staples. You take those three guys and put them on the Alabama team, Alabama wins the national title. I think he's right. So if you have to have 3 or 4 difference makers, who are those difference makers going to be? So while we can sit here and look at each game individually, Georgia's still got to go out and get it done. All that said, even with those questions, the way that Kirby Smart handled Media Day and the way the other programs showed deference to him and the way the media showed respect for Kirby Smart, there was no arguing. There was no debating that maybe this program's better. That everybody is Georgia walks by and it's Georgia. That is the takeaway, that Georgia is indeed cemented on top of college football for at least another 6 weeks.
That's right. We are, I believe, 44 days away from the start of the season. We are through talking season here, although I guess maybe talking season continues in August. I don't know. Steve Spurrier started something. Surprise, he doesn't finish well.
No, I got it. Now, you know that, okay, so this is where, you may
have been in the room when talking season was invented. So
we know, okay, so one of the weirdest, oddest things on the planet is that the guy who's never covered Steve Spurrier runs his coaching award. That's me, okay? And I never covered him, never really knew him, but he's got a coaching award and I'm associate. I did want to point out that Coach Spurrier did not make that post. That was somebody that made that post on his social media account. Now, if I know Steve Spurrier right, I'm not saying that he wouldn't have done it if he would have thought about it eventually. But here's the thing. Spurrier and Kirby played golf together in the regions. And the fact is, Spurrier, and he won't say it publicly, but he is a Kirby Smart fan. Not just because of the visor either. Like, there's a part of Spurrier that would love to go up against Kirby, not because he thinks, but because of the challenge, right? Like Spurrier will tell you, when you look at Spurrier, Saban head-to-head, take a look at it, right? Because Spurrier got the better of him. He beat Saban head-to-head more than Saban beat him. And rolled him pretty good, by the way, when Florida played LSU. But even beat him at South Carolina over Alabama. So, but there is a part of him that would like that challenge. And so he's got that respect for Kirby Smart. And Kirby probably has some begrudging respect for the old ball coach. There's too much dog in Kirby to ever be a Steve Spurrier fan. Just not going to happen. But so there's a begrudging respect between these guys. But for Coach Spurrier, he would not have publicly done that, because he does. So I can say that, Connor. I do need to make that clarification that was somebody on his social media post that did that. So
all right. Defending Steve Spurrier. That's the sign here on DawgNation that we got to wrap it up. We're thankful BA is not here to hear that. My name is Connor Riley. That's been Mike Griffith. As I mentioned earlier in the show, preseason All SEC teams come out tomorrow. Media voting for predicted order of finish. Surprised Georgia's going to be first in that. Comes out tomorrow as well. Fall camp expected to begin for Georgia sometime in early August. I believe either August 2nd or 3rd, depending on when they can start there. We've got Brandon Adams, DawgNation Daily tomorrow. Mike Griffith on the beat on Monday night. Jeff Sintel, like Nick Saban and unlike Kirby Smart, taking a vacation to Italy right now. He'll be back next Wednesday, recapping before the Hedges. Justin Williams, 5-star inside linebacker, set to announce his commitment on Monday night. DawgNation will have that covered there. We have my show on Sunday night, Connor in coverage. So for a full week at SEC Media Days, that is Mike Griffith. My name is Connor Riley. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, bearing with us with some of the storms here in Athens. Thanks, guys. Enjoy it, and football will be here before you know it.